Welcome to the Logistics Point interviews. Today I'm joined by Antony Francis from Endava, and he's the consultant in supply chain and logistics there. Antony, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Today we're talking about 2021 and most importantly about what is going to happen in the industry in 2022. But always when we are looking into the future, I think it's important to also know what happened in the past. So what are the trends for 2021 that you think are the most important, and how are they affecting next year or maybe the years after?
Yeah, it's true. When you look back when almost actually to 2020 and asked what were the initial things that went wrong in the supply chain, because it didn't just start with COVID or the pandemic. There were issues that were already there, shortage of drivers. There was to some extent some backlogs in ports, partly because you didn't have drivers for the drayage companies pulling containers out of ports. And then demand grew very quickly as COVID hit. People were at home, more online buying. So we went from pallets to cases to eaches, which put pressure on fulfillment arms. But at the same time, people were beginning working from home. They were also doing more home projects to create office space, to create different things, changing out kitchens and appliances. So all of that had an increased effect in volume, and we had the same capacity. So it started creating the issue of backlogs that we had in ports. Last week we were, I think, still at 88 ships off Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles over here. I know Felixstowe has had its own issues, Rotterdam as well. Here we made a decision a few weeks ago when the president called all the 3PLs and logistics companies to the White House. They said, well, one thing we can do is open the ports for 24 hours. Well, that's all well and good. All you're doing then is loading containers onto the dock, and if you can't get the containers out, you have a mountain. And imagine going to the lowest container. The dock management systems are pretty good today, so we're able to know where a container is. But if it's below 20 other levels of containers, which is the case in some ports at the moment, you have a big issue. You've got to move all the other 20 levels before you can get that one at the bottom. So that creates an issue in the port. Then you can't get drivers because there's been about a 90% turnover in drivers in some of the trucking companies this year, partly because a lot of new players have entered the space because there is demand. And so people have churned heavily within the industry. And still today, we can't get drivers. An interesting anecdote in the US for regulations. So if I'm 18 years old, I can drive a tank if I'm in the Army, but I can't go across state lines until I'm 21 driving a truck. And that's the interstate regulations that are in place as a federal thing here. So that's just an anecdote of the issue, but we do have a big supply chain crisis over here. And I don't know what we're going to see as we go into 22. The pundits all say it's going to be a sort of consensus Q3 2022 before this self-absorbs. I personally don't think that's true. I think it's going to go beyond that. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is the fact that you can have two types of project for technology-driven improvement in the supply chain or in a logistics operation. One is very short-term. You can do some things like forecasting, trying to improve forecasting. But like any project in a warehouse to switch out high bay racking, to put in robotics, for instance, to put in a omni-channel fulfillment arm at the end of it, that takes time. And as you know, a lot of companies have what we call a code freeze between November as you get into peak season and February as you come out of peak, get through the return season. And then they have another code freeze coming up 8 months later, right? So there's only a certain window of opportunity to do stuff. And so what I see happening is, okay, you can do some short-term fixes going into 2022, but the major fixes that will help infrastructure and warehouse operations, those are longer-term projects. They're going to go into 2023.
And you mentioned the word shortages, specifically about labor shortages. Mm-hmm. And the other thing when it comes to shortages is supply chain. Which one of the two do you think will be the most important? And how can we actually prepare to solve this crisis?
Yes, of course, you know that forecasting is the perfect science. And it's really trying to build predictive analytics into the forecasting process. So you go back using algorithms and using some AI in that. That's something that we can do. But again, that's a project that you've got to plan for. And so I think that's the principal thing about the supply. Now, obviously, if you haven't placed your orders to your suppliers by now, and we're coming up to Thanksgiving this Thursday in the US. You don't have the same sort of issues, I think, in Europe at least. So we're coming up to Thanksgiving, which is followed on Friday by what we call Black Friday, and then Cyber Monday is the following Monday. If the product's not off a ship, well, if it's not in the store today, the Friday is blown, right? So, and then we get 4 weeks after that, we're into Christmas, and basically, if it's not off I think if it's not off a ship, or about the ship's about to dock, you're dead in the water. I was saying to some people last week, I think there'll be a lot of artificial Christmas trees being sold in sale mode in February. So you better. That's an opportunity perhaps to buy your artificial tree for next year, because they're still stuck offshore. There were 88 last week. Someone told me that there's another 75 ships on the sea at the moment coming into the West Coast. That's an awful lot of stuff coming off ships, and it's going to be sitting off there for several more weeks.
And do you think that in what you mentioned, what the White House is doing and how they invited supply chain experts, do you think this will be enough? Do you think we need more help from governments and port authorities?
Well, I'm not a great always in favor of government intervention and stuff. I prefer more of a liberal approach to this, but that's a personal opinion. But they can't solve everything. They can suggest ideas, but we've been talking about this for months. It's not like it's suddenly, we woke up and discovered we have a crisis. We've known we've had a crisis for the last several months. I was in a store this week called Bed Bath & Beyond here, which is a household goods type store. And I noticed that certain of the areas, they do a very good job of masking the shortage of supply. But I noticed how thin compared to previous years, they were filling the shelves, but it wasn't deep, 3 deep or 4 deep on the shelf. It was all pushed up to the front. So it looked fine, but really I'm sure that they will have a shortage of supply.
And earlier we did with you a Q&A specifically about planning peak 2022 now.
Yes.
Do you think that organizations will have the capacity? Rates at the moment are high. There is not enough capacity. Should they wait, or do they not have any other options but to contact suppliers now?
I think they have to think seriously about backing up the order process to earlier in the year, and maybe pulse orders through more in smaller pieces. The big retailers, I think, have solved a lot of it because they're actually contracting complete ships, and moving their product on them. So they have the leverage, they have the opportunity to do that. The small suppliers, they're still a little stuck because they've got to work through forwarders and shipping companies, and they're consolidated with other buyers. So I think that's a concern. I think the bigger companies will actually get through this more easily, perhaps, than the smaller shops.
And finally, and you also said just now, retailers. A lot of the focus during the last 2 years of the pandemic was on retail. How do you think that they have managed to overcome all of these problems? And how has it transformed the way they think and behave?
Well, of course, there's been a huge move to e-commerce, so that also impacts the amount of inventory that you carry in a store. But then, as you get into an omni-channel mode where you can buy online, pick up in store, so they've been thinking through all sorts of different ideas to improve the process. But as you just said, the rates are astronomical at the moment, both on air freight and sea freight. They're four times what they were a year ago. So you look at the total landed cost of an item. Who's going to pay? It's the consumer who's going to, because they're going to pass it through. The forwarders have got increased costs. They're going to pass it to their customers, obviously, because they're not going to lose money. And so at the end of the day, it's the poor consumer and we're seeing that with the high level of inflation. They're saying that certain supplies around the Thanksgiving period are 14% up on last year. That's a high level of inflation, and it's dangerous.
Thank you very much for your time. And to all the viewers, you will be able to learn a bit more from Endava and from Antony's insights in the description down below. Antony, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.